Peace be upon you and welcome to Waystations. My name is Rehan Khan, your co-host for today's show, where we are going to be discussing the subject of when nothing matters. Now, I'm joined by my regular co-host, Dr. Walead Mosaad. Dr. Walead, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, Rehan. How are you? Good to see you as usual.
Yes, good to see you as well. I'm doing very well. Thank you. I'm doing very well. Now, I think if you had said to traditional people that nothing matters, they would probably hold you up on the statement and they would say, well, no, actually, everything matters. Your belief, the way you talk, the way you dress, the way you conduct yourself, your general sense of being, your general sense of purpose. But I think, for many modern people, that isn't the case. There's a sense that, well, nothing really matters. And this word or this kind of sentiment is captured by this word nihilism or nihilism, some would say. And it comes from the Latin, which means nihil, meaning nothing. And nihilism has been described as a philosophical position, but it's a bit more than that. It's kind of a lived reality for many people, and it shapes much of modern day culture. It shapes much of popular culture. It shapes much of how people see themselves and how they interact with the world. And we're going to, discuss some of those things. And I think one of the core tenets of nihilism is the fact that it doesn't distinguish between good and evil or better and worse. It's just that, anything kind of goes. And if every position is regarded as perfectly valid and equal, there's kind of no standard, if you like, to distinguish between good and bad. So those are some of the subjects we're going to kind of cover today, and the impact really on humans and our thinking and how we conduct ourselves. So, Dr. Walead, just after that kind of introduction, if I can just ask you maybe, in the modern world, there is this sense of optimistic nihilism, which kind of has been described as a general sense of existential fatigue. This idea that because the solar system, the universe is so vast and we're so small, nothing really matters, right? This huge universe out there, and we're just these tiny little things going around on a tiny little planet. From your perspective, is this modern nihilism something new, or is it just an old human sentiment or old human struggle that's wearing a new mask?
That's a very interesting premise that you put forth, and maybe I'll counter it with hopefully an equally interesting premise. And the answer would be yes and no, I think. It's old in a sense and new in a sense. Old in the sense that I think human beings, since they ever were human beings, likely struggled with the question of meaning of life and who am I, what am I doing here? And obviously when they observe their surroundings and they just notice the grandness of it, at least from a physical perspective, very early human beings worship these things, right? They look at the sun, they look at the moon, they look at the planets, fire, trees, they saw this as something quite grand and something maybe even spiritual in a sense, and that they thought that this gives me meaning. These things that I see that have this largesse, or at least, physically speaking, compared to human being, much larger. And we can recall from the Quranic narrative of Abraham, the great prophet, and alayhi salam, and he had this kind of dialectic in front of his people, and he looked at the planets, he looked at the moon, he looked at the sun. He said, all those things appear, but then they go away. So they can't be my Lord. My Lord has to be something that's not something that comes and goes, but there has to be a permanence to it. So as if he's saying, if you're looking for meaning, if you're looking for something, how to make sense of all of this, and if something really matters, then there has to be a permanence about it, and maybe a perennial nature about it too. That it's not just for this blip and moment in time that we exist in, but must be true for all the people before us, and it must be true for all the people after us. So that being said, I think those questions have been struggled with. What may be new nowadays is what you described as optimistic nihilism, and that, well, nothing matters, so it's all the same. I can just do whatever I want. That wouldn't have been the conclusion drawn from the old perspective. I think the conclusion that would have drawn would be like, oh, then I have to keep searching, or there has to be a meaning to it, and I will find it, and I will discover it. Right? It's there to be discovered. Whereas I think today we've been presented, obviously we're living at the, I don't know if I want to say the pyramid of history, where all this stuff has happened before us, and we're sort of at the top, which may not be actually true. If there's millennia to follow us, who knows? But I think that from that perspective, we would say that so much of this cumulative philosophical information that I think people now have this sense of it's already been constructed for me, and I have to choose amongst the scaffolded, constructed points of view that are already out there. So am I going to be an existentialist? Am I going to be a transcendentalist? Am I going to be, take it from a theological perspective, and so forth? And I think this is overwhelming for the modern person. And at the same time, we had podcasts about this, just the vast amount of information that's out there and the easy accessibility of it all, right? Because I can go look up all the words we just used. You can go look up on Google and you'll have and then put it through an AI chat or project. And you have literally in seconds, if not, maybe minutes maximum, all of this vast information. And then you look at it all and you're like, it looks all the same. From the perspective that it came from the same source, and you don't make a discernment between any of it. And I think that is highly unnerving. And I empathize with people who look at all of that and then say, I don't see the difference. It's all the same, just people talking, just talking heads. Whether they lived in the past or they live now, they're all kind of saying very similar things about constructing what this meaning is. And so what has happened, and we've touched upon this theme earlier, where my theory is we've removed the experiential and we've made it just intellectual and, or theoretical, let's say. And as a result, people are just looking at all of these different theories about the meaning of life and what it could be, but they feel this disconnect because it doesn't relate to them. It's not relevant because they don't even have their own experience to draw upon in trying to connect with these different issues and these different perspectives and answers to the meaning of the universe and the meaning of life and so forth. So I think it's an age-old question, but at the same time, we're struggling with it because we're just in a deluge of so much accessibility of information that it's quite difficult to sift through that. And, and amongst that accessibility is, looking to what you've been working with in your field. And we have people who write, obviously, things, nonfiction, and talk about these things in kind of discrete intellectual ways. And then we have, maybe science fiction or things that are written from kind of a semi-quasi fictional level. And if you look at the culture nowadays, at least my perspective, the culture is leaning heavily into this kind of very dark realism, cynical anti-heroes, people who, used to be the hero. Superman never killed anybody in the old Superman, right? And now the modern iterations of Superman, okay, it's no problem. Like Superman can kill people. So there's this kind of, I think, lessening of that structure. And it seems to shift towards nihilism. Though it doesn't matter at the end, right? If you stick to a moral code or you don't stick to a moral code, and someone like yourself who's dedicated to virtue-based storytelling, how do you see the role of the author in this culture, in this age of, let's say, skepticism? Is the story just saying something matters, or do you have to kind of combat this creeping nihilism that you find, that the culture seems to be obsessed with?
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that. I think there's one view that, well, writers should just write and not worry about the subtext of what they're writing. But I think the subtext is really important. The kind of the allegory. Many would disagree with me. They say, no, allegory is not important, just tell the story. But I think if you're going to write virtue-based stories, then the allegory, the kind of the moral dilemmas you want to explore, and the spiritual architecture you want to put into a story, it does matter, actually. You don't have to agree with my position, but that's the way I see it. What a lot of modern day stories have done, and you've kind of mentioned that sort of dark realism, the cynical anti-hero. These essentially are, I think, very much like nihilistic stories where conventional morality is very much depicted as bankrupt, right? So conventional morality is depicted as as bankrupt. So, Deadpool can go and do whatever he wants to do as a superhero, but it's okay, And so I think in these stories, what also happens is that there's no possible recourse to some kind of higher standard or to God or to some kind of something that's come down from outside, the human structures. There's no recourse to that. It's just that, well, we decide. Now, I think this type of thing has been around. If you look in stories and novels and plays, if you take something like Shakespeare's Macbeth, so in Macbeth, there's a very famous line towards the end of the play where Macbeth says, "Life is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing." Okay, so life is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing, which is a very nihilistic statement. Like, nothing matters, right? It doesn't really matter. But what Shakespeare is doing, he is portraying Macbeth as the character, as someone who's advocating that nothing matters. It's a nihilistic position, okay? But the play itself is not nihilistic because Macbeth gets his comeuppance, right? He's and so Shakespeare is saying, well, actually, this doesn't work. There are because what he puts out comes back to plague him, comes back to haunt him. So the play itself is a refutation of that position. So I think that's something that Shakespeare is getting across in terms of much more kind of virtue led. But a lot of modern day stories are very much colored with this notion of nihilism. And just to touch on that, I think it's an idea which many have linked back to Friedrich Nietzsche, who was a German philosopher. And in his book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, where he said that there is no divine being, this kind of, he speaks about a death of God in this book. And so really his polemic or his argument or his discourse is very much one of anti-religion, right? And then if there is no higher being, there is no divinity, then really nothing matters. You can just do what you want. And so the people who will then frame societies will be what Nietzsche calls the Übermensch in German, which is Superman, like the strong. The strong will essentially shape society in their vision. And for him, that kind of creative, kind of radical ideation of making the world into how you see it is the highest form of self-creation, what he calls ex nihilo, to create from nothing. So you don't have anything you're using, no structure, no frame, no belief, but you create ex nihilo from nothing. And that's the highest form of human pursuit, which is why you can see obviously why people like Nietzsche are very popular to certain ideological positions of the 20th century, people who are trying to do very much that thing. So I think that is kind of like, and you see that coming out, that thing around nothing really matters. My reality is just as important and, as your reality. There's no standard. And so many of the stories that we do come across are very confused in that way, and they end up confusing the audiences as well. And I would subscribe to much more of a traditional based storytelling. Even if you look at a story like Beowulf, which was written around the 7th century, they think by some English monks, but they're not entirely sure. But Beowulf is a really fascinating story because there's this king, Beowulf, who essentially goes to help the Scandinavians fight off this kind of monster Grendel and Grendel's mother. And Beowulf is telling them, look, you're having all these calamities come on you because you've stopped believing in God. Right? You've stopped subscribing to a higher, order, and you're just, doing things yourself. So I think these stories are there, but unfortunately, the modern trend is towards nihilistic stories. And sometimes you'll watch a film or a play or read a book, and then at the end of it, you'll be like, "What was that all about?" Because it's just like it had no purpose. Yeah,
Increasingly so. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's something that we as storytellers do need to be mindful of. One thing I'd like to ask you, if I may, is that I think if you look at traditional faith-based beliefs, they tend to give weight, they tend to give meaning and legal reality to most aspects of a person's life. Okay. Now, how would a very much a traditional person who's grown up in a tradition where, these things are important, how would they respond to this kind of modern mindset that says actions have no intrinsic value?
That's an interesting question. Maybe drawing on what I said earlier, I think another big difference between, let's say, what a pre-modern person, if we're going to use that term, I would confront all of this versus today, is that the pre-modern person actually had a lot of help, much more help than we have today. So, even in, let's say, 1950s United States or even before that, the church played a very central role in many people's lives, like the local church and the local pastor. And I think the community bonds are much stronger. There's a book I think we discussed earlier called The Bowling Alone. Maybe it came up before. And he kind of recounts, the breakdown of these social structures, at least in a place like the United States, which I think would be probably very common in other places. And, that's only looking about, less than a century ago, 75 years ago or so. But they had these institutions, right, that were there to kind of soften the blow, of looking into, let's say, the void of, okay, who am I? What am I doing? What am I supposed to be? What's there if I'm not anything? And so there was a way to kind of, console the narrative, I think, that was available to them in much greater ways, or at least people put more stock in such things previously than they do today. Nowadays, a kid can be on the internet, can be on the computer, and literally all of these things we're talking about and more times whatever magnitude you want to put is literally there at their fingertips. And so it gives the illusion that I don't need any of these institutions or these teachers or any of these intermediaries, let's call them, for me to kind of try to make sense of this. But then when he goes and she tries to make sense of this and get into it, you're lost, right? And you feel more lost than when you started looking into it. And sometimes you may even regret that you actually looked into it. And then invariably, if you go talk to somebody, right, and maybe you counter thoughts of depression a little bit, or angst, and they'll think like, no, it's no use. Even if I talk to somebody, it's no use. What are they going to tell me that I haven't read already, or that I've seen on the internet, or has been presented to me? So I go back to what I said earlier, that we have to get out of the realm of the theoretical, and we have to get back in the realm of the experiential, and I mean true experience. Not via even the intermediary of the screen and of the information networks, that are just bombarding us day and night. To actually get out there, forge human connections, forge connections with nature. We talked about Henry Thoreau earlier in Walden Pond, and he did that, right? And that was even a couple of centuries ago, and it wasn't that long ago, but he felt like he needed to commune with nature and get, back to the basics and so forth. And I would say also from kind of a Quranic Islamic narrative point of view, all these things around us, it's called the alam, right? It's called, translated loosely as world, but it means sign, indicator. So it's the thing that's going to indicate to you what life's all about. It's the thing that indicates to you, that gives meaning. So it's to dig beneath the surface of just the superficial and then look below that and see how these things mean something, right? The Quran directs us to this constantly, and we have created everything in pairs so that you may recall, that you may remember. That's a clarion call for introspection, for contemplation. Why is everything in pairs? That's interesting. That's true. Even in animal kingdom, in the plant kingdom, plant life, you find things that are actually in pairs. And then in another verse, it'll say, and we created everything from water, so that you may also recall. That's true. 75% of the Earth's surface is water. And the body, I don't know, 90%, whatever it is liquid, and so forth. And you see the parallels then, right? And, these are the sorts of reflections and contemplations and so forth that are needed and necessary. And then you proceed that, or you pair that with actually thinking about the most true of all those things, about all those things that we, if you're a person of faith, is that none of this could have come from a vacuum. That none of this could have come just in vain, right? And the Quran asserts this very vociferously. We have not created the heavens and the earth and everything in between in vain. Because that was also an old refrain, as we said earlier. It's not something that's just been said now, but Our lives end when we die, and it's just time that takes us away, and nothing is meaningful after that. That was the refrain of the people who opposed the Prophet Muhammad, for example, in Quraysh. So, I guess my advice or my counsel to people who are thinking about these things, just engage on a different level, in a different way. And now, the information networks and technology has been the conventional way. And now we're asking to do something unconventional, which was used to be conventional, which is actually to get out there and experience things and experience relationships and talk to different people. And people would be surprised because they think, well, it's all going to be the same. But the thing is, if you are looking at things theoretically and you haven't experienced them, then it's very common to dismiss them without actually trying it first. So I would say to young people, even older people who are struggling with these sorts of things, that you connect with people who, have experience, have life experience, people over 50 years of age, or, if you know anyone like that, that can help them with these sorts of things. And then I think then life's meaning will be discovered and not constructed by others on your behalf. So, I think that would be a step forward, inshallah, in a way to look at that. But I was thinking about what you're saying earlier, Sidi Rehan, about the novels that you write and, approaching characters and having some sort of, moral authority and kind of taking a stand with some of these things. But could you provide some example of these, realistic stories or novels that, that are in the popular culture? And in your historical fiction novels, how do you bring attention to virtues and things like honor and honesty and duty and faith and, that feel attractive to the modern reader has been conditioned by stories where nothing really matters, which is quite a contrast between the two.
Yeah, no, thank you, and thanks for some good advice there. I think if you look at popular culture and nihilistic stories, and I'll try and choose a few which people may have heard of or either read the book or they may have watched the films for it. So I think what these nihilistic kind of popular culture stories often do, they put people in a frame of mind where there's a sense of meaninglessness, hopelessness, kind of loneliness and kind of alienation. And you once you've experienced that popular culture, read that book, seen that movie, you just feel like, nothing really matters here. So there's a couple of examples. Like if one would be like something like A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess, which really was a novel written in 1962. There was a film made of it, and it was banned for many, many years. And it's really explores nihilism really through a protagonist who just gives way to his urges. Really, he has no humanity whatsoever. And what the author is doing is portraying people just pretty much like animals and who have no remorse. And it portrays the characters embracing this concept of nothingness. Yeah, there's no standard; anything goes, and that's a book that was, extremely popular in the '60s, and so a film was made of it as well, and it was banned for many, many years for obvious kind of reasons. But that's again, you kind of experiment with something like that. That starts to go into your mind and starts to affect the way you live. It's going to make you feel pretty down. Another book, probably one from the '90s, would be something like American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis. And it portrays a really kind of narcissistic protagonist with no kind of moral obligations. And the protagonist leads a kind of a double life. He's a very successful businessman by daytime, but at nighttime he's just has a bloodlust and just goes around, killing people really. And he has no standard, has no morals, and then just pursues what Nietzsche would call creative destruction, right? To really shape the world in his own kind of image. And it's interesting because towards the end of the book, the protagonist, Patrick Bateman, realizes that he's actually just trapped in this cycle of consumerism, and he becomes isolated, and he becomes, he just feels adrift from the world because he doesn't actually have any support, doesn't have any family, doesn't have anyone around him at all. And he realizes he's become trapped by this whole thing that he's just created around him as well. And the third book I'd probably give an example would be something like No Country for Old Men by Cormac McCarthy. And it kind of portrays a barren setting in the US. I think it's near the border, And there's a hitman who essentially kills without remorse. And I think there's a line in the book that life with no strings attached. I think that's what it was called, life with no strings attached. And what Cormac McCarthy is really showing is the fact that when old values or old morals, when they die out in society and they're not replaced, by something, then it can lead to this kind of situation. So all those three books have become very popular movies as well. And they just, if you consume that kind of thing, it just creates a particular mindset. Now, I'm not saying to people don't do that, but if you like it, fine, go ahead. But what I would suggest is there are other books, obviously, that have a counter view, and we can cover some of those off a little bit later on. Some other alternative, more positive kind of fiction. But you asked me also about one of my books, Tomb of Empires, which is a historic fiction set in 90 BC. So yes, I explore concepts of virtue like courage. What does it mean to be courageous? I pursue concepts like temperance. What does it mean to have temperance or moderation? And ultimately, the story really is around how can you find God? How can you know God? And that's what the heart of the story is all about. But of course, when you're exploring some of those deeper questions like courage and temperance, what you want to do in a novel, you want to show both sides of the argument. So maybe as the reader is progressing through the novel, they're thinking, oh, okay, what's going to prevail is the fact that virtue doesn't pay off. But then you show no, virtue does pay off. Then maybe you swing it back to no, virtue doesn't pay off. But then you show virtue does pay off. So as a writer, what you're doing, you're kind of taking the reader through this exploration of these virtues in the story and through the plot. And how you choose to end it is obviously, what your position is, because in some of the books I've mentioned before, those kind of virtues, they're not worth keeping, right? Whereas other books, they'll end on a much more higher kind of note. So I think, I do think that it's something which there's a lot in the popular culture which is very nihilistic, but then equally there are many writers who are trying to write an alternative approach, and obviously we need to try and encourage all of those who do that. One thing, if I could ask you, Dr. Walead, which is the fact that within many kind of mystical traditions, such as Sufism, for example, there is this consideration given to the concept of nothingness, or in the Arabic, it would be, I think, fana, annihilation of the self. Now, this concept of nothingness or annihilation of the self, some might say, well, this notion of annihilation sounds a little bit nihilistic. Can you maybe just untangle this for us and explain the difference between the kind of Western existentialist view of nothingness, which can lead to despair, and the more kind of Sufi or mystical view of nothingness, which might be actually a pathway towards the divine?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And obviously, my initial answer is they're not the same. Obviously, you can't talk about fana, at least let's say from the Sufi perspective, which does mean annihilation, but annihilation of what? Of the egoistic self, not the existential self. And then it means you have to also mention in the same vein al-baqa, which is the remaining of the higher self. So you have to look at it in terms of lower self, higher self. So the lower self is what we're trying to, in a sense, they use the word annihilation to translate it. I don't know. It kind of, I think, gives the wrong impression. Fana does have that connotation, but it means يعني أن تفنى عن صفاتك الذميمة, يعني to annihilate the bad qualities, the bad traits about yourself, which would be, as mentioned in the Quran, النفس الأمارة بالسوء, the inciting soul to evil, and to remove its bad qualities, where it's just concerned with itself, which means actually it's a soul that doesn't think things have meaning and it can just do whatever it wants to do. So you want to kind of extinguish that, or kind of replace that with the higher self, right? An-nafs al-mutma'inna, for example, as mentioned, right? The contented or the serene soul, right, which has achieved some semblance of balance and equilibrium with its creator and with the creation around it, and has made sense of all of this and has made meaning to it. If you look at, however, the existential, let's say, annihilation or of Jean-Paul Sartre or somebody like that, it's like, Sufis know that there's something behind the veil, and they want to lift the veil and they want to get to what is actually the real, right? Or, from the nothingness of the temporary and the ephemeral, from that spiritual perspective, to the everythingness of the real, of al-haq, of God. Where Sartre, I think, lifts the veil and then he doesn't find anything. And then that leads him to despair and to angst and to anxiety. And it's quite dark. And this is what people are contending with, right? Okay, what if I lift the veil and there's actually nothing there? What if this is all there is, and it's just me and my choices, and nothing actually matters, right? And that's more or less the conclusion that they draw. So, what's the difference? What's the problem? I think if I had to put my finger on it, I would say these sort of very important, beyond, let's say, beyond rational, beyond just the mere province of the rational, can't be solved by the rational. So the mistake of the philosophers is that they're attempting to do it that way. Because by definition, what is philosophy except if it's, using the means of the rational and to figure things out. So when the rational hits a brick wall and can't penetrate beyond that, then it's left with nothingness. Then it's left, okay, nothing means anything. But with people of faith, or specifically, let's say the Sufi tradition within Islam, they already recognize that, we know the rational is not going to get us to this point, right? We know that it's not about delving deeper into theological dialectic, for example, to get a greater understanding of God. Actually, that doesn't help, and it may hinder. And many of the great Sufis said that even that hinders, like Al-Ghazali, like Ibn Arabi, said very similar things about that. So what they're saying is you got to go for the experiential spiritual, which can only be done by a contemplation beyond the limits of the rational, let's say into the supra-rational, by remembrance of God, by prayer, by meditation, by thought, by doing of good works, by following the role and example of prophets before us, Prophet Muhammad, for example, specific for the Muslim tradition, and so forth. And then you will be in a prepared state for acceptance of a higher level of understanding, because you're at a higher level of consciousness. And then when the veil is lifted, and they actually use those terms, yurfa al-hijab, when the veil is lifted, then you find the light, not the darkness. Whereas the philosophers, they lift the veil, they think they are, and all they find is dark, and then they lead us further down the road of despair. Whereas I think the theologians or let's say the faith-based practitioners who are into experience lift the veil and they find the light, and they find that their sense of meaning and who they are is even more enhanced, because it's a path of love. It's not a path of just, it's like using cold surgical tools of rationality, right? To get, and you're like, if say the human body is what we're trying to figure out, or the human existence, opening up and seeing the physical heart and the intestines and all of that stuff, and just cutting through, and you look at it like, I don't see anything, right? But you're using the wrong tools. You can't use a scalpel to get to the meaning of that. What you have to use is something that you're not going to see in the physical realm, right? But something that you may observe and experience in a higher realm, in a spiritual realm, in a meditative state, and so forth. So, I think they're quite different. And, the Sufis, they talk about this word khayal, which you're obviously familiar with, since one of your books has that title. But in their imagination, no pun intended, because it means imagination, but it's the ability to think beyond the rational to some degree, right? This idea of khayal, right? And to know that there are signs that indicate something beyond which I can, let's say, conceptualize in a physical sense, but I can nonetheless know by way of having this some element of khayal. And I know that's a happy topic for you, let's say fantasy, and it's an amazing genre for exploring, these sort of grand themes, because you get to design the whole world of the novel, right? And it's kind of its own ecosystem, where maybe in our actual world, people feel lost in this random universe, or what appears to be a random universe because they can't make sense of it. But fantasy allows you to create these worlds, and have these prophecies and connections and cosmic balances and so forth. So I'm really interested, how would you use that particular canvas of high fantasy, to show that a single regular person's choices have some sort of cosmic weight?
Yeah. So again, getting back to the fact that your actions have meaning to things around you, right? Which is where we kind of started off. So high fantasy for sure. Yeah, that like the Tolkien kind of universe for sure. But let me maybe give an example of a popular culture film that perhaps not a lot of people would have seen. Take the Christopher Nolan kind of Batman films. Okay, now. Many people have seen them one of the highest grossing kind of comic book adaptations. And take like the second film, like The Dark Knight. Now in this, what we see is that we see the Batman character who kind of, in this kind of in this fantasy story, who represents the people, he represents a symbol, right, for the people of Gotham. And, he says that anyone can be the Batman, right? So he is trying to inspire people to remember there are higher moral codes. There's a better way to live. There is right and there is wrong. Whereas the Joker character represents nihilism. Nothing matters. Chaos. And you essentially create from chaos, which is pure Nietzsche, right? Pure Nietzsche. I don't know how much of that is intentional by Christopher Nolan or not, but it probably was. And so what you see is you see the Batman resisting nihilism, right? And he's trying to inspire ordinary citizens to fight against the League of Shadows as well, who are this kind of Nietzschean organization who want to destroy Gotham and then to build anew, right, from that. Again, very classic Nietzsche, which is creative destruction, first destroy and then build. And of course you have stories like the film like Dr. Strangelove, very much like that, mad scientist who wants to destroy the world and build from new. And so what the Batman character is doing, he's trying to move towards this more idealistic, hopeful vision that his parents had as well, that you can make a difference to people's lives, right? Compared to this kind of League of Shadows, who seem to be very much cut off from the world. Whereas, Batman is connected to the world. He's connected with the Commissioner Gordon, and he's connected with the lawyer, Rachel Dawes, and he's connected with other people and his butler and so on. And so I think the film makes a really strong case for that actually there is this alternative way of doing things, it doesn't mean that, nothing matters as well. And I think there's a famous line in the film when the butler, played by Michael Caine, tells the Batman that was it? Some men just want to see the world burn, right?
Yeah, I was just thinking of that when you were talking about this.
Yeah, that's a really famous line, right? Some men just want to see the world burn, which is just that whole kind of nihilistic thing. And that's why when the Joker sits on that pile of money and then he burns it, and then the criminal goes, "What are you doing?" He said, "Well, it doesn't really matter, does it?" So I think that is that hopeful message that Gotham is not beyond redemption, right? And so you got a film like that. Whereas another film, going back a bit, something like Seven with Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman. It's, oh my God, it's such a depressing film. It's like, I wouldn't recommend watching it to anyone. It's not a very nice thing to watch. I kind of watched it and I regretted watching it afterwards. But in that, you're just left with this kind of brokenness that, this whole world is just is falling apart. It's just, everything is very grim, very dark, and so on. So you have a lot of stories in the popular culture that way. So I think Batman is a good example of a modern day fantasy story told with hope. The other example maybe to give would be the Harry Potter books by J.K. Rowling. If you look, there's a very famous line within the book where Voldemort, I think, says at one point to Harry, he says, "There is no good or evil, only power, and those too weak to use it." Right? So Voldemort says that to Harry. There is no good or evil, only power, and those too weak to use it. So again, classic Nietzsche. I don't know how much that influenced J.K. Rowling's writing, but I think those stories also, are a counterpoint to that notion that nothing matters. and that whole story is cocooned within this idea of love and the fact that Harry's mother, her love for him was more powerful than Voldemort's hate for him, and it kind of revolves around that notion of love. So you mentioned Khayal and Tales of Khayal, which is obviously a book that I have with co-collaborator Peter Gould. Now, in that, we explore this notion of spiritual imagination. If you look at fantasy stories generally, they have some kind of magic system. You have to, like Harry Potter books have a spell book, and you say these spells, and such and such thing will happen. Or in other fantasy stories, you eat something and you get more stronger. So in Tales of Khayal, the idea is that through your spiritual heart, you access certain powers that come from the divine, from the kind of imaginal realm. And you can access those powers from that imaginal realm and bring those powers into this world, depending on the state of your heart. And you can do that in a Nurani way, which you could translate as kind of light-based, or you could do it in a more Zulmi way, which you could kind of translate roughly as dark-based. I know they don't translate exactly as light and dark, but just broadly. So the nature of the state of your heart gives you access to certain powers. And so I think what that does, again, from a storytelling perspective, it introduces this notion of spiritual imagination into fantasy as well. So I think again, there are lots of examples out there for us to either draw on to inspire us to, or not, or to make us depressed. But I think if one last question, if I may, Dr. Walead, for you, if there's someone out there right now listening to this podcast and they're feeling a little bit trapped, in a place where they think that nothing really matters, and they feel that maybe they're just kind of standing above a void, above an abyss, looking down, what would you say to them in terms of maybe the steps that they need to take towards some kind of healing?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I think that's a more common occurrence than we'd like to believe. And I was thinking about this earlier. I think to relieve oneself of the pressure of having to solve the whole thing all at once, this whole theory of everything approach, and I need to know how it all works. And, we don't even know how we work, I don't even know how my air conditioner works. So let alone how the universe works, and to have some sort of grand narrative. And if I don't kind of figure that part out, then take it one. No, life's a journey. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint. So take it one step at a time. And as I said earlier, delve a little bit into experiential things. The thing that we're missing in the modern world is having this kind of community buffer and assistance when we're exploring these questions. So I would also tell people, don't put all the pressure on yourself as an individual, that you're sitting there and have to figure it out. And you were talking earlier about kind of how this has come into the culture, and it's also all seems like an individual quest all the time. Even the anti-hero, as you mentioned, doesn't really have friends and kind of retreats back to their apartment. I think like Deadpool, and like there's nothing there, and they're just sitting there, and it gives you the impression that everyone's on their own, and we don't have to be everyone is on their own. We don't have to live that. That's a constructed reality. It doesn't have to be the reality. So I would advise such people, and we've had, I think, a podcast on the idea of community and sohbah, and it's very important. And bring yourself to be part of different communities. Join a book club, join a tennis quartet, whatever it is, and experience things, right? And just interact with people, and take the steps one at a time. And you'd be surprised that, you think, well, how is playing tennis, or how is joining an art class or anything like that going to solve these? You'd be surprised how much insight, right? Because if we say that everything around us is a reflection of discovering that ultimate reality, then you will find bits and pieces of it everywhere. Nothing will be devoid of that if you're looking for it, and if you're contemplating it, and you're engaging with it. So don't worry about the big picture yet. Take it one step at a time. Live life one breath at a time. Take things as they come. Every day is kind of every day. Take one day and so forth. And then, focus less on the theory of it all. I know people read philosophy, and I read philosophy quite a bit in earlier days, but to be honest with you, at this point in my life and let's say my career, I'm not that much interested anymore. I think it's people struggling with things where the answers are there, but you're looking in the wrong place and you're using the wrong tools to get to them. And even putting it in the framework of problems and answers or problems and solutions is very much modern thing too, right? Those are chemistry words to begin with and words of science and not words to be used to apply to, the meaning of life, as it were. So that would be my main advice. And, lean on family, lean on friends, lean on community, even lean on just getting to know people. Go get out there and get to know people and try to meet them where they're at. The easiest way to get to know people is you show interest in what they're interested in, and listening to them and, seeing what they have to say about something before you say something about it. These sort of skills are very important, I think, in terms of making connections. So that would be, and there are many different communities out there. And I know, Rayhan, you're part of kind of the writer and artist community, which is a very vibrant one, and I think on the forefront of many of these questions in many ways. But in that particular community, how do you all avoid this trap of creating stories where, following the popular culture that nothing matters? What's the alternative? How do you go about doing it?
Yeah, I think one of the things to really think about here is the fact that, we are engaged in these stories. Because if you look around, a lot of the stories out there on Netflix and other things, they're very nihilistic. And then children, when they're writing stories, and if you've ever been a judge on a writing competition, you'll realize that many people are writing things they've just seen on Netflix in a different kind of format, and just kind of the same old, nothing, nothing, nothing. So I think to anchor and to root your storytelling in things that are relevant to the human condition, things that have always been relevant to the human condition have been things about family, about friendship, things that have happened at a societal level, and to really tackle some of the big questions that humans have always been preoccupied with. So humans have always been preoccupied with questions about God, about existence, about family, about love, about fate, about free will, about, war and peace. And these kind of ideas, if you tackle these kind of ideas through your literature, then you're going to layer your stories with great meaning, right? So if you take a book like the Iliad, it's a story about love and friendship, but it's also about fate and free will, right? And today we live in a time where people are saying, well, AI and algorithms are nudging, manipulating us. So we also have this notion of, do we have free will if we're being nudged by these things? So it's a relevant question which Homer, the blind poet, explored in the 8th century BC, and we're exploring today because it's part of the human condition. Do you have choice or do you not have choice, right? Or take a book like The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky, and it's really about not being judgmental. It's about forgiving. It's better to show people forgiveness. It's better to give them a second chance, right? So again, you look at today's cancel culture. Are you giving people a second chance, right? So it's the same thing, it's the same human condition. So I think it's really important then for writers who want to make a difference to their writing and not fall into the trap that nothing matters, to choose topics where, yes, you tell a great story, it's great setting, great character, great plot, but it's, you write your story within the fabric of these ideas about what are important to human beings, which I kind of described, some of those things that are there. So that would be really my advice to myself and to other writers and artists as well. So I think we're kind of nearly done for this week's show, Dr. Waleed. And as is our custom, we like to give a good book reference maybe at the end just to wrap things up. Do you have a book that you'd recommend today?
I have a couple of books, one old, one new. One very new, actually, just released, I think, a couple weeks ago. But the old one in Arabic, Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal, or Deliverance from Error, for Imam Ghazali. And it almost reads like an autobiography. And he was someone who was at the height of his career in Abbasid Baghdad. And he, people knew him and on the street, and he was a great teacher, and he was, had patronage from the Sultan and things like this. But he felt like, what does it mean? And this feeling was nagging on him until one day he goes to teach and no words come out of his mouth. He's literally unable to say anything to teach. So he ostensibly took a break or a sojourn or a sabbatical from there, and he was gone 10 years. And during that time, he went into experiential, and then he wrote Ihya Ulumuddin. So probably one of the greatest works ever written in the Islamic tradition. And in it, he calls it the revival. And I think we've talked about this earlier in the podcast. So he's reviving the Islamic sciences, and they're not just there as this sort of scholastic curriculum only. And that's why he often talks about people who only look at it sort of a scholastic curriculum and use it to enrich themselves. And he calls them ulama as-su, or ulama ad-dunya, the scholars for dunya, for the lower self or the lower life, versus ulama al-akhirah, those for the higher self or the higher life. And so I think that would be a quite proven and interesting read for people, for things we're talking about. And then the new book that was just released, I think, a few years ago, I've read it already, by Albert Brooks, so I tend to follow him. He used to be an academic, and now he's kind of doing his own thing. He's a Catholic, but he looks at kind of these ponderous questions, and he entitled this latest book of his, The Meaning of Your Life. And he has some personal history in there, and talks about how he was, a classic violinist, and he wanted to go into that, and then he went into something more practical, and he worked in a corporate world, and then at 55 years of age, he made a career change. But throughout all of that, he was trying to, get to some sort of meaning of the whole thing. And one of the things I really liked that he said, that I recall, this idea of work-life balance, which I think got some notoriety. Maybe you were in the corporate world, I think maybe in the 90s it started that way. And he said, what does that actually mean? Your work should be your life. If you're spending so much time at work, then why would that separation is there? And say, he's encouraging people to find meaning even in what they think is the mundane and the ordinary, which is to be just present for that thing. And that's what a lot of the mindfulness ideas come about today. Like, just be present when washing the dishes or reading a book, or for us, for people from a faith background, it's like, yeah, obviously, I mean, we want to have hudur, we want to have presence, we want to be there. So I think he makes a lot of good points, and he brings a lot of anecdotes in that book that I think would be useful. So those would be my two recommendations. What about yourself?
Okay. Yeah, I would recommend actually The Conference of the Birds by Farid Attar, which obviously is an interesting story about these birds going on this journey to find the Seymour, the phoenix, who they see as their kind of creator. And it's why I choose that, because it's a book about a spiritual journey towards God. But none of the birds really want to do anything at the beginning. They're all just sort of like, no, I can't go on this journey. And they're all making excuses not to go. And the hoopy bird, the hudhud, is their guide or their sheikh, and is gradually, gently cajoling them all, because the hudhud understands their nature, and is cajoling them all to get to get moving. And then they go on this journey, and by going on the journey, they discover that actually what they were looking for was inside of them all along, because the divine was within them. So I think it's quite an interesting story in the sense that it's about, not just sitting around doing nothing, but actually, everything matters. Your one step matters, what you say matters, the way you conduct yourself matters, and it all adds up in the end towards something as well. So I think I'd go with that one. Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Reed. I think it was really, I definitely enjoyed the conversation today, and got to speak about one of my old favorite subjects, Batman. I used to be a comic collector when I was in my university days. Probably, I shouldn't really be saying that on air about now, but I'll put that out there. Yes, I was a comic collector back in the 1990s. So I've had a lot of Batman, Dark Knight comics. I managed to get that into a podcast. I feel very good about that today.
That's quite the accomplishment.
Great stuff. All right. Thank you. And thank you so much to our listeners for tuning in and giving us your time. And if you do like the show, please do leave a rating. It definitely helps as well. Thank you so much. All the best, and peace be upon you.